All right, if folks want to drift back, we're going to get started in a second. I'll ask the folks standing to find your way back to your seats. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to everyone joining us online. We're excited for the last piece of the puzzle in our program today. For those of you joining us online, we've had a very active program over the last few hours where we got introduced to the ELA Hackathon this year, and also learned a little bit about environmental innovation, talked to some of the problem holders. So we're ready to kick off, as are our friends and colleagues in Laurier University, who are also starting their hackathon challenge there. So this is our last piece of the puzzle. We've got 4 fantastic panelists here to share a little bit of their perspective on water data, water challenges, and a little bit of opportunities and advice for the folks in the room. I've got a few questions to kick us off, and then we'll open it up to folks in the audience. So if you do have questions, feel free to jump in. For those of you who are joining us with a little bit more of a data science perspective, this is a chance to pick the brains of some of the water experts in the room. So we've got 4 fantastic panelists. We've got Jay Myers from Bold Commerce. We've got Tika Newton joining us from Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation. We've got Ray Hessling, retired but previously a scientist at Experimental Lakes area. And we've got Claire Herbert joining us from the Canadian Watershed Information Network at the University of Manitoba. So let's go down the line. If I can give each of our panelists a couple of minutes just to tell us a little bit about your role and what you're currently working on.
Sure. We're sharing this mic, so I'll just grab it real quick. So I'm one of the founders of a company called Bold Commerce here in Winnipeg. We're a technology company, not in the water space at all. So we build e-commerce apps, we power over 100,000 stores, but very much technology focused. And we've actually done a number of initiatives with IISD, and I was just talking to Pauline. I think the last one was either 2018 or 2019, and just the thing that really struck me actually sitting here listening was I remember that hackathon being all about better ways to collect data, make it more affordable, make it more accessible, and here we are 4 or 5 years later. Now what do we do with the data? So it's good to reflect a little bit that there's been a lot of improvement, at least like the data's there, but now it's interpreting it. So I just wanted to make that observation, as hadn't been involved the last couple of years, and the last hackathon it was all about the challenge around collecting it. The other thing, at Bold we're a technology company and we do hackathons all the time, and so for those involved, hackathons are a big way that we develop product that we ship that is out in the market, and it starts as a hackathon to prove a concept. It's an MVP. It doesn't have to be market ready, but it proves a concept of what can then be polished and built and taken to market. So this is very much the way that products get built in the real world. This is the way we design products. And so it's really neat to see this being done this way, and I'm excited for when these things end up getting taken to market. But just so you know, this is not just a experimental fun thing. Like, a lot of these can get built on and actually become things that are shipped, that are used every day. So excited to be a part of this, and I probably took over my time already, so I'll pass on the mic. So.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Tika Newton. I am from Kenora in Treaty 3 territory, just across the border in Ontario. I'm the International Watershed Coordinator for Lake of the Woods, the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed. I work part-time for the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation and part-time for the International Joint Commission, which is a binational organization that manages the transboundary waters between Canada and the US, from Atlantic to Pacific, pretty much. In our basin, the challenge of collecting data is pretty profound. You've heard from my colleague, Chris. We work quite closely with Grand Council Treaty 3. It's a really big watershed. It's sparsely populated. There are not a lot of non-governmental entities in our watershed doing data collection. But my job as the International Watershed Coordinator is to try to convene all of those parties. Lots of them are government agencies at different levels of government in both Canada and the United States, Ontario and Manitoba, and Indigenous governments, and to try to find ways to ensure that people can work together across differences in methodology and differences in focus and funding, and make sure that that data is all accessible and channeled into solving problems that are common across the watershed. So this is my first time being involved in a hackathon event, and I'm really excited to see what kinds of solutions come up, because I think they're going to be immensely applicable to many watersheds, including ours, even though that's not necessarily the focus of some of the problem statements that you've seen. But really looking forward to it. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Ray Hessline. As Alan mentioned, I was a research scientist with the Experimental Lakes Area under Fisheries and Oceans Canada. I was originally trained in geochemistry, but after 40 years at ELA, you pick up a lot of information about aquatic biology as well. I also got chances to work in other areas in Canada along the Hudson Bay coast, Mackenzie Delta area, and the Northern Rivers Basins project in Alberta. I really was a technical scientist and did quite a bit of method development, working with modification of instruments. Interesting, going back to one of the earlier presentations in terms of clients, I would say I was my own client. I saw science problems that didn't have the right methodology or the right instrumentation, and I tried to solve them by pursuing that. Also, I did quite a bit of work with computer modeling of data, but not statistical modeling. I'm not a stats person. My view of stats is they help you outline a problem, but I like mechanistic models to solve problems. I'm a cause and effect type of person. And more recently, I still am involved with the Experimental Lakes Area. I'm on the research advisory board for them. I'm also on the board of directors for Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society in Manitoba, and I'm a science advisor for the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. So I have now been exposed to the broader type of problems that organizations of that sort are dealing with.
So as Alan said, wow, that's loud. My name's Claire Herbert. I work at the University of Manitoba. I'm situated in the Faculty of Environment, Earth and Resources, and I'm actually within a center there, which is the Center for Earth Observation Science. So my background is I am a freshwater biogeographer. So I look at freshwater quality and in-lake processes in relation to space and time. So I use satellites to do them, as well as going on those lakes and taking water quality samples. My area of research is based around algal toxins and water quality processes in relation to climate change at the moment. And in relation to this group, I also am the data manager for the Canadian Watershed Information Network, which is a data center within the Faculty of Environment that it was originally developed by Environment and Climate Change Canada as a way to store and share freshwater research data, because they understood that we do have a real big problem sharing that kind of data and making it publicly accessible. And then the government realized they had a problem trying to create a database, so they transferred it to the University of Manitoba, where we spent a lot of time figuring out how we could best create something that would allow us to share the the hundreds of different types of data that we collect. So we collect a lot of data. We're our own customers in that sense, but we also work collaboratively with community-based monitoring organizations, a lot of indigenous groups. So how do we make that data accessible and understandable in a way for local communities? So the water dashboard is of particular interest to us because that is still the state we want to get to, and we're not quite there yet. We spent a lot of time figuring out just how to get the data into a system that could help us work in partnership with other groups like Living Lakes Canada, because as Maggie pointed out, freshwater data is not, it's not as well standardized as it should be. So if you get information from one data center, how do you know it's the same as you get from another data center, and how can you actually access the same type of data across multiple places in Canada and know that the information or the meaning is the same? So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with. So thanks.
Thanks all. So I might turn it back to Ray, just to tell us a little bit about the process. I mean, I've never had a chance to visit Experimental Lakes area, unfortunately, and I really hope to. Tell us a little bit about the boots on the ground work of data collection.
Okay, well, first I think I'll say that, I mean, one of the really outstanding and unique capabilities that the Experimental Lakes area provides is that it's a large group of people collecting data on different areas. So when you collect data in your own project, there's a huge amount of context. If you're looking at, let's say, a project on gas exchange between the water and the atmosphere, there's someone else looking at temperature. There's a meteorological site that's measuring wind velocities. There's an understanding of the ice dynamics under other projects. So I think that's really, I would say the big thing about the Experimental Lakes area is the breadth of work and the length of work. So you can also look back over 50 years of data collection to see what the trends have been over time in a lot of these systems. So that's really what I would say what is special about working at the Experimental Lakes area, and I think it's really is valuable to understand how important context is in interpreting any data set.
Thanks, Ray. Claire, you mentioned a little bit about sort of the work that you do to share data and make sure that the data that we collect, sort of we find ways to bridge those across the different communities that need to use it, especially with climate change. And you mentioned that climate is accelerating some of the risks that lakes face. Tell us about the importance of being able to actually use and share the data that we collect.
So I think one thing that was made abundantly obvious during COVID, but we as scientists understood, was that communicating science, evidence-based science, to make evidence-based decisions is really critical. And so we as scientists are really great at collecting data, and we are really terrible at communicating that in a way that other people can understand. So we worked a lot over the last decade with other groups to figure out ways. There are common language terms that can be used that have been developed by people that are much cleverer than me to make sure we're talking about the same variable, so whether it's phosphorus, nitrogen, or chlorophyll. And then by working with the communities that are most impacted or have identified these things as a problem, we can understand how we can communicate that information back to them. So one of our programs right now, for example, is actually, so we do ecosystem research, meaning we don't look at just water quality, we look at the entire environment in a lot of our programs. And one of the things we're working with the Manitoba Métis Federation is we're working with weather station data. So we've worked with them to set up weather stations in areas around lakes where there isn't data being currently collected. So we'll complement Environment Canada weather stations, but also allow the citizens to have weather stations that are actually close to their lakes. And through that process, we spent a lot of time talking to the program people at the MMF that are going to be delivering the programs, as well as with the citizens to understand how they wanted that information communicated back. So we actually have 3 different ways that we share that information, right? We have a very straightforward dashboard that the citizens wanted. Most people don't want anything fancy. They just want to understand the information in context. So we worked with them to identify that. And then to take that up some steps, so how then do you translate that into data that you can use to inform governments? And so we created dashboards for that as well, and processes that the MMF can continue to use and recreate.
Thanks, Claire. Tika, you mentioned, speaking of Claire's point of communicating with government, you mentioned that your work is sort of at that intersection of watershed health and communicating with multiple levels of government. So can you speak a little bit to how does government fit into this picture, and what are some of the challenges when we talk about communicating data to some of the folks that are making policy and regulations based on that data?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And Claire, I totally agree with so much of what you said. So I guess I'll just start by saying my background is actually in climate change. I have worked on climate policy for a long time, and I have also worked on water issues for quite a long time. And in both of these fields, I see there's a really common thread of doing excellent science and gathering a lot of evidence to make really well-informed decisions in policy, and then completely falling flat on communicating that in plain language to people so that the average person understands why policy matters. And I think that as a watershed organization, or, the watershed coordinator, working with all these different levels of government and different groups and communities, we're facing the complexity of how to take data and move it through that policy-making machine and have something come out the other end of it that impacts people where they live, and have people engage with that and understand the value of it. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see for us. Not all levels of government work in the same way. They don't necessarily speak the same language to one another. So there's some sort of soft skills diplomacy that goes into trying to ensure that the work that we do on the ground finds its way into the various departments of government and the machinery of government to make policies or decisions, but then that also needs to be fed back to the public that will be at the receiving end of implementation of policy. So, for example, in our basin right now, there are kind of 2 big things that are on people's minds. So one is the ongoing issue of water quality with harmful algal blooms and cyanotoxins. There's been a change in species profile for algae over the last few decades, and we now have a lot more toxic algae than we used to. Lake of the Woods has always had algae blooms, but they're now toxic. And so that's an issue that average people are really concerned about. Government researchers are doing tons of good science to understand the problem, and one of my jobs is to try to help communicate out what that science is, how it impacts people, and what we're doing to try to alleviate that algae problem. Another good example is that in 2022, we had a catastrophic flood across our watershed, and the issue of water levels regulation is really poorly understood by the general public. People do not know how the decisions are made, and it was a big learning experience for everybody involved last year to realize that we need to do a better job on communicating all levels of decision making and what informs those decisions, what the important dates are when decisions are made, and what choices we have when we're regulating water levels and making those regulatory decisions. So communication is really, really important, every bit as important as the basic science.
Thanks, Tika. And Jay, we're going to switch a little bit to chatting about the solution side. So we've heard about a number of different water-related challenges and watershed challenges. So putting on a little bit of the hat that you wear as a business leader, how do you approach customer or problem discovery? So what do you do when you're faced with a challenge and trying to figure out, where do I start?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is asking the right questions. And so approaching problems with good questions is how you end up with good product. And so a lot of times when if we build bad product, it's because we ask the wrong questions to begin with often. And so when I'm listening to all the different ideas, the problem statements, and then there's ideas going through everyone's head, what can I build? How can I solve this problem? Going one step deeper is, so a good example of this is I always tell our staff is like when someone says they need a hammer, let's just say you're selling a hammer, and someone says, I need to put this nail in the wall. And so you think, I need a hammer. But what you really need is you need the nail in the wall, or do you just need the nail in the wall, or do you need the shelf on the wall? And is it actually the shelf on the wall, or do you need somewhere to put your books? And when you understand what, like I'm thinking about your dashboard, for example. What is it that she really needs? A dashboard is a way that people express that they want to be able to ask questions to the data and get answers back. So the dashboard, there's 100 different UIs for dashboards out there. I don't think a dashboard specifically is what you want. You probably want to be able to ask questions to the data and have it shown in a very user-friendly way that is easy to digest, and then ultimately ask questions of that data and then ask more questions. And so I don't know what stage everyone is at in their of ideation of the solutions, but as you're thinking about solving these problems, try to get one layer deeper in what are they actually trying to do. There's this theory called the jobs to be done theory. I would encourage anyone to look it up, but it's the way that when you're building software, what job does that software do? And they call it the jobs to be done theory. And when you understand what the job is that software does, like, Facebook isn't actually to keep you connected with your friends and family. It's to solve your addiction to release endorphins when you post something and people like it, and that's actually the job it does. Facebook knows that, but they say it's to stay connected with your friends and family. So try to get one layer deeper on what the job is to be done, and that lets you build better product versus just looking at the requirements, ask better questions, and then you get better product.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. We're going to open it up if anyone in the audience wants to jump in with questions. Yeah, we've got a hand back there. Okay, just to repeat that back so folks online can hear us. So it's a little bit about the communication challenge. There's a lot of data that's collected, but we still see these communication challenges. What are some of the solutions that you've seen? Anyone who wants to jump in?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. The question you're asking, I think, is about jargon and how to get away from the use of scientific jargon when you're communicating with the public. So in my previous life, before I was working on water, I worked on climate. And to unpack climate concepts and climate policy concepts for a broad audience when I was communicating, I often would pretend that I was talking to my kids. And my kids at the time were really little. They were 5 to 10 years old. And I would just really simplify things and put it in very plain language. If I can't distill a policy concept down to something that a child can understand, then that policy concept is probably too complex to fly. Like, it's not going to get much traction. So I think that it's really important for people doing scientific research to be able to distill their question or their ideas down into something very simple, and to always keep that in mind when you're trying to pitch it to somebody. That would be my advice, anyhow.
All right, I'm seeing nods. I'm going to open it up for anyone else. Perfect. We've got a couple of questions. Go ahead. Awesome. We'll broaden that up a little bit just because the specific problem holders aren't on the panel, but data visualization is a tool. What questions can data visualization in this context, in your work, help us answer?
So, yeah, I'm not one of the problem creators for this, but I think it's in some sense very similar in that what you described as the question is really sometimes part of it. So the best developers I have, which Maggie shares, were the ones that came to me so I said, this is what I think my problem is. I need to share my data. I need to make it accessible and all these other things. And they spent a lot of time just breaking down with me what I actually needed to do. So do you need to share all your data? Is it some of it? What's it supposed to look like? Who's your audience? A lot of questions that I just didn't have the expertise to understand had to be part of the solution. So part of this is just asking those kind of questions to the people who you're trying to provide the solution for, because it can, in our case, it means creating visualizations for different levels of audience. So that comes from the very simple dashboard, which is a number and a graph that looks like a car, speedometer, to a mapping platform where that same data is exposed there, but now you can overlay different sites, you can manipulate it, you can download it, right? So different levels of complexity based on your user is really important to us. And then we take that a step further. Do you have users from different communities? Is it important to translate that into different languages, for example? Does that have to be part of your solution? Do people want to see it on paper? Technology is wonderful, but sometimes you also have to have like the one-page primer for people so that you can print it off, you can take it to community meetings, you can give it to people who are never going to look at their computer. Sorry.
No, great, thanks. I saw another hand in the back. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks for that question. I'll repeat quickly back, which is just thinking about drinking water threats, and asbestos is one in particular that was called out, but maybe zooming out a little bit more broadly, just based on what panelists can speak to. What are some of the threats to our drinking water, particularly in cities, and what are some of the challenges to dealing with those threats, whether it be asbestos or lead might be another one?
Well, I think there's two aspects to the problem you're posing. One is trust. You have some concern about different expert opinions. One maybe that's coming from a doctor, one that's coming from city regulators, testers of water. So I think when we build a system that gives us information on this kind of a concern, we also have to build a system that develops trust from the community. And that's not a simple thing, and it hasn't been done well in a lot of cases. But it's critical. And I think one of the fundamentals in developing trust is these efforts to open data and open the process. And that's one aspect that has to be achieved. I can't give an answer necessarily of how to do that in this specific case. The other thing is, for every specific problem, whether it's asbestos or lead in pipes, in water, there has to be an appropriate plan developed, which requires an understanding of, first, of the system. How is the water distributed from the main point? So let's say in the case of Winnipeg, from the Deacon's Reservoir through all the pipes, and how is it delivered to each location? So does the problem initiate prior to that distribution, or is it somewhere along the distribution and you have to understand the system? Then you can design your sampling program to be appropriate, because you don't want to take all your samples in one place that give you one answer and miss all the rest of it that might be flowing in a different pattern. So really, I think that gets into this other aspect that people have discussed to some extent, is how do you create an appropriate plan for collecting data? If you don't collect good data, it's really of no value in coming up with the solution.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. Interesting questions. So the question was around agriculture, irrigation, soil. How does that affect our watersheds? And also, how do researchers navigate some of the contaminants that they might encounter in their work day to day?
All right, I can answer this for Lake of the Woods, but I am not in Manitoba. Well, Lake of the Woods does go into Manitoba a bit, but I think the question that you're asking is a slightly more Manitoba context than a Northwestern Ontario one. We don't have that much agriculture in our area, so we don't have to deal that much with the threat from agricultural contaminants. However, in the Lake of the Woods watershed, so I mentioned there's this problem with cyanotoxins, with toxic algae. The driver of algae blooms is predominantly phosphorus, which generally does come from different kinds of terrestrial runoff. So it can come from sewage, it can come from industrial waste effluent. The historical legacy of contaminants in our watershed seems to be the industrial pollution that was put into the Rainy River, which is the headwaters for Lake of the Woods, in the mid-20th century. So it was pulp and paper effluent predominantly. And it's kind of buried in the sediment in the south end of the lake, and it gets churned up and redistributed and fed back into the system, and it takes a very long time for it to flush out, but that's what we're hoping to see happen. In the meantime, the way that we are addressing it through policy is to try to set water quality objectives for that nutrient. So water quality objective in this case is a binationally agreed. So Canada and the United States agree to a target level for phosphorus and then have to come up with a plan to try to reach that target level. And there has to be some kind of monitoring, some kind of reporting, and ideally some kind of action taken when that level is exceeded. We also have a whole series of alert levels that we're developing for other contaminants or issues of concern. So they could be contaminants like nitrogen, but they could also be ecosystem health indicators. So something else going on, so something impacted by climate change, like shoreline erosion or something like that. And those sorts of things can be tracked by more local governments or provincial governments. There are just different ways of responding to that, sort of in a more localized context. But that's how we're dealing with that issue in Lake of the Woods. And I know from my work through the International Joint Commission that all the various watershed boards of the IJC that exist across that Canada-US transboundary are doing similar types of of policy making and setting in place that infrastructure to be able to report on water quality and measure those contaminants of concern and do something about it, have governments do something about it.
Claire or Ray, do you want to speak a little bit more to agriculture and some of the contaminants that come from that? So agriculture and aquaculture, if anyone can speak to those.
Well, I can talk a bit about aquaculture. I'm fairly familiar with the approaches taken in Canada. Mostly, well, there are two basic types. One is cage culture, and cage culture is primarily used for salmon farming, let's say off the west coast. It's also, though, used in some large systems in lakes. There's a very large cage culture in Lake Diefenbaker in Saskatchewan. There's also most of the other cage culture in Canada is carried on in Lake Huron. And cage culture, typically, one has cages that are cubes of netting, maybe 30 meters on a side, with tens of thousands of fish grown in there, and the fish are fed artificial food. I mean, they're not feeding on their own from the waters there. They'd never find enough food at those densities. So it's very similar in a sense to a land-based farm operation. The animals are contained and they're fed a prescribed diet at a prescribed rate, and then they are harvested when they reach appropriate size. And really the downsides of both land farming and aquaculture are similar in terms of contamination. The contamination results from the wastes from the feeding and the waste from the animals when they're feeding, and in some cases excess food, but that's rare now because excess food is expensive. So the farmers work very hard on not feeding any more than they need to get the growth that they want out of in this case, the fish. But certainly waste from the animals, whether it's pig farms or aquaculture cages, is the main concern in terms of eutrophication of waters, and it's a serious problem in a lot of cases, and it's a license requirement that they submit plans for how they're going to deal with this and what the expectations are for the contribution of those wastes to the particular water body that they're working in. And I would say, in most cases, it's relatively successful. But the composition of the feed is well known because it's manufactured, so they know the materials that they're dealing with and the potentially toxic contaminants.
So if I can add just in terms of agriculture, because I know nothing about aquaculture. So other things, so everything Ray said, of course, so to just add on to that, this is where I think the science and working with the stakeholders, in this case, say the farmers, is important because basically what scientists do is spend a lot of time working with different groups to help them understand what the problem is and what can be done about it. And sometimes that's because in the last few years they've discovered something new. So for example, animal waste is a big issue, but we also realized that, so one of the ways to protect the water bodies was to plant riparian zones, so to plant vegetation along a water body so that the plants would absorb that material. But what we now know is that for cold area zones like Manitoba, that doesn't help in the spring because there is no vegetation and the soil's still frozen. So you've gotten not just agricultural, say, phosphorus spread on as a fertilizer in early spring. You've got ground still frozen. You've got urban planning that's still an issue. You've got cabins around lakes. And all of these things, a lot of the original infrastructure was built assuming that the soil would absorb a lot of those nutrients. And it can't do that in the spring when the ground's still frozen, for example. So if you get a high precipitation event like snow melt or rain, then that runoff is taking all those nutrients right into your water body. So now we have to think about other ways to solve that problem, which can be working with farmers, offering incentives to build retention ponds, where we can let the water go slowly back into the landscape when the soils aren't frozen. And so those are called best management practices, and those are developed in conjunction with municipalities and groups that are on the landscape all the time. And we're constantly trying to improve those and update them with the latest science so that we're protecting our water bodies. And then in terms of when we're taking samples for, say, cyanotoxins, it's mostly when we're analyzing them that we would take a lot of precautions. So, wearing gloves and protective gear, making sure you're not inhaling a bunch of water when you're opening sample bottles. And we would do the same for our community members. We would give them gloves if they were taking toxin samples.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Claire brought up one very interesting aspect in analyzing data that I alluded to with respect to ELA, and that is context. I mean, a lot of the best practices or approaches to managing agricultural runoff came out of studies in Pennsylvania, and they were excellent studies. And initially, they were applied in Manitoba, like the growth of riparian zones along rivers. But due to work done by some of the soil scientists at University of Manitoba, they found that the studies that came out of Pennsylvania, where they had snow melt and rain over the whole winter period, on and off, simply didn't apply in Manitoba because we have one big load of runoff from over frozen soils. So even though their work was fine and was perfectly applicable in Pennsylvania, it was not the right answer in Manitoba, and we had to develop different strategies afterwards to deal with the same problems here.
I'll add one more thing. So going back to wearing my policy hat, so I said we don't really have that much agriculture around Lake of the Woods, but there is an agricultural belt down at Rainy River where Rainy River feeds into Lake of the Woods. And it's interesting to see where science and economics and government policy come to a bit of an intersection and sometimes tension. So right now, the province of Ontario, the government, is putting a lot of money into economic development in our region by incentivizing tile drainage for agriculture, which is basically like installing giant weeping tile under the soil to help drain off agricultural lands. And that water then carries a lot of nutrient and has the potential to go into receiving water bodies like the Rainy River, which, if not done thoughtfully, could result in a lot more nutrient runoff coming into the system, and that would make the algae problem worse. So there is this whole intersection of land use management planning, economic imperatives, government political policy making, and science. And it's not always really straightforward what the right answer is, and it requires a lot of relationship building and diplomacy and talking with communities and landowners and farmers and politicians. Like, everybody needs to be in the room and talking to one another to figure out what we're all trying to achieve and what the common good is. Like, everybody wants to be able to put food on their table, and everybody wants clean water, and everybody wants a nice place to live. So how do we achieve that and those outcomes for everybody, recognizing that there are sometimes competing interests?
Thank you for that, and thanks for those questions. Really interesting to see how something that starts as a technical problem, which is how do we track or regulate a particular substance turns very quickly into this sort of regional planning problem or larger planning problem of how do we collectively manage and steward a resource. In our last few minutes, I want to bring us back to advice that we can share with our hackathon participants. And Jay, I might ask you to kick this one off. You were actually involved in the last hackathon that IISD hosted here, along with aqua hacking, and that was an aqua hacking competition, and you mentioned that a little bit earlier. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen work well in a pitch and what you've seen work less well as we start to take some of the great solutions that will be developed over the next 2 weeks and try to communicate them back to the problem holders.
I think a lot about, like, ultimately, you know, there's electric cars. Well, actually, the first electric car was 1908. But it didn't take off because they looked weird, and they were, until the electric cars looked good, people didn't want them. And so I think a lot of times, like, things don't, even though they're 100% what is good for the world, they don't make it through because of all the stakeholders and public opinion. It might not be business viable. It might not make money to, I think when you're pitching ideas and thinking how to package it all up, when there's greater opportunity for it to be accessible by more people, maybe even potentially some economic opportunity, like, that's huge. And I think all three of the scenarios here, I'm actually surprised this didn't come up once tonight, but the opportunity for AI to layer on top of a lot of these things. Because these data sets and these dashboards, like, once that data is in a structured way, AI can interpret a lot of this as well too. And then opportunity for, that just broadens it out. So, like, there is a lot of opportunity to make this accessible, not just to the different problem holders. That's right, problem holders. I think there's a broader opportunity as well here too. So when you're pitching it, keep that in mind. You're not just checking the boxes that they stated. Think about a little bit of the bigger impact. That makes it more, I think, appealing to get selected. So.
Thanks, Jay. And Tika, Ray, and Claire, I'm going to ask you a version of the same question, which is, you're not the problem holders, but you're in many ways navigating similar challenges. So can you speak a little bit to advice that you might have for our hackathon participants as they both dive into what might at first seem very overwhelming? We saw some of those data spreadsheets and snapshots. And then also in terms of being able to craft a compelling solution.
So I'm very new to hackathons, and I'm just listening to what Jay was saying and thinking about, well, there are a couple of projects I'm working on right now that actually involve creating these kind of visualization tools and user dashboards and interfaces. But thinking about what Jay was saying about the things that succeed and the things that fail, part of the goal of doing the whole putting all the effort into generating visualization tools for the public is so that the public will come and actually use them. If they're complicated, if they seem technical, if it seems in any way daunting, people aren't going to pick it up. If it's fun, they will. And if it has something that has them returning for some kind of incentive or reward, just like you mentioned, Facebook gives you likes. I think about my wretched little Duolingo app that uses cartoons to make me come back to it every single day to practice my German exercises. Like, those things actually work. Stimulating people's endorphins and dopamine works. So if you can find ways to do that and make things playful and fun and not really overwhelming, that would be amazing, I think.
Well, I'm a bit torn about this one because I'm coming from a technical background. I never avoided complexity in natural systems. I never shied from equations. But I certainly understand the challenge of presenting this information to the more general public. And I think, one has to somehow stay true to the science side. You can't ignore the technical relationships. You can't, if you're designing a system to even to describe what someone needs to do to solve the problem of nutrients coming out of streams on the prairie, you still need to talk or provide an understanding of a system that is frozen when the water runs off, and that the streams, often the smaller streams, they run hard for 3 or 4 days and then they go back to a very low flow, and if you miss that, you miss the solution. So I don't think I can give an answer, but I can pose that problem that somehow you have to preserve the real characteristics of the system that you deal with, and at the same time make the description of the solution more palatable. So, I think that's a problem that you're going to have to face in this effort.
So to echo Tika and Ray's points, I think they are excellent descriptions of the challenges you're looking at. And as someone who has to say no a lot to developers with their great ideas, what I always go back to is I just want to push a button. I want to push a button and I want to get an answer at my most basic level. So I liked your question about what do you want to see in a data visualization dashboard. My thoughts are always start simple and know your audience. And that's going to be the most challenging piece, because if you're trying to adjust everything from citizen scientists to having data that can be defensible in government policy making, you've got a huge range. So when we look at solutions, we look at what's the simplest thing we can do. I just want an answer. I want to know if it's above community guidelines. I want to know what this means for my community. I just want to push a button. I don't care about the 30,000 things that underlie this data, right? This is where I'm going to start. And then build layers if you can. But then you can get the science underneath it. Here's the supporting information. Here's another level that I can get to where I can actually analyze and access more of the data if I have that capacity. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of this.
Thanks. And Jay, is there anything you want to leave us with in terms of advice for our hackathon participants?
Don't be afraid to make mistakes. This is experimental, and it should be fun. Go in with an open mind and a really, really good. Don't start until you have a really good idea of the problem. So ask a lot of questions. Like, none of these problem statements should be all you need. If you're just going to work now without asking questions, you're probably, I can guarantee, not going to build a good solution. Dig a little bit deeper, get to that second layer, ask some more questions, and the end product will be like drastically better than if you just walked away right now and said, I think I got it. I'm a developer, I can go and I can solve this. Ask good questions, because it's not going to come down to your development skills, it's going to come down to how well you understand the problem. And a poor developer who understands the problem really well will always be better than a great developer that doesn't understand the problem. So I would leave it with that.
And that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining and sharing your experience with us today. And thank you so much for all of the participants and mentors and folks that are in the audience today, and for folks joining us online. So for everyone who is jumping into the hackathon over the next couple of weeks, stay tuned for updates on the HackWorks platform. And for everyone who is physically in the room with us in Winnipeg, there is some dinner waiting for you. So we will sign off and dive into that. Thanks all.